So, over the next few minutes, I will share some reflections on my current research agenda that bridges Pacific and Atlantic lowland territories in Colombia, Ecuador, and my home state of North Carolina. Anchoring these interventions is my ongoing research and analysis regarding slavery, law, and the early modern African diaspora, which provoke ongoing questions regarding coloniality, territories, and sovereignty. For this dialogue, I wish to meditate on the community anchored research engagements that have allowed me to bridge my work in the North Andes and the Afro Pacific lowlands to that of coastal North Carolina. So here I'll be discussing Black geopolitics, Atlantic Pacific lowlands, and the digital humanities. I want to start with a Pacific bookend. In August of 2016, while serving as the director of Northwestern Center for African American History and the co-convener of the Buffett Institute's Andean Cultures and Histories Working Group, I had the good fortune to begin to deepen my explorations of contemporary Afro-Pacific cultures and geopolitics. The late Buddy Foster of the Phelps Stokes Foundation had insisted that I deepen dialogues with colleagues at La Universidad Tecnológico in Quibdó, as well as those at the Universidad del Pacífico in Buenaventura, in order to brainstorm around collaborations. While in Bogota, I met the famed chef Ray Guerrero, who invited me to the Festival Petronio in Cali, named after Petronio Alvarez. Over the last 30 years, this festival has commemorated the rich, vibrant cultures of Afro Pacific lowlands that stretch from Panama in the north southward into Esmeraldas in the south, calling attention to the diverse musical, food, and folkways that constitute Black geographies and their diasporas to places such as Cali, Bogota, Houston, Washington, D.C., New York, Chicago, and beyond. The diversity of instrumentation and foodstuffs on display at this festival got me to thinking in a more contemporary manner about one of the most thoroughly Africanized regions in the Americas on the one hand, and the water based cultures and geographies that flow through them on the other, an Atlantic bookend. Returning to the Carolinas Low Country later that summer with my then teenage daughters in tow, we visited Brookfield Gardens, a plantation on the edges of North and South Carolina Atlantic lowlands. And while touring the premises of what was once a slave plantation, we took a boat tour that ran along the creeks that dotted the estate. This furthered my thinking about waterways and the conjuncture of Atlantic and Pacific African diasporas, their geographies, and lowland estuary based cultures that Africans constituted, innovated, and sustained over time. In this sense, it was my training as a scholar of colonial Latin American history that helped me to begin to think anew about contemporary geopolitics and ultimately the promise of digital methods to make visible new modes of imagining genealogies of the present. Indeed, it was considering the water based fluvial cultures, to borrow from scholar Claudia Leal, of the Andean Afro Pacific lowlands that forced me to reconsider the waterways and estuary based cultures of the Carolina lowlands of my home region of southeastern North Carolina. This thinking around 2016 was nourished by the work of the Gullah Geechee Heritage Commission, as well as my growing engagements with the African American Heritage Foundation of Southeastern North Carolina. I'd been invited to work with them around later on in 2018 in dialogue with Mr. Al Beatty, as well as the late George Beatty, who were working on the restoration of Reeves Chapel Church, a church built on the banks of the Cape Fear River during Reconstruction by formerly enslaved people. They were also working in relationship to developing North Carolina's Rice Festival at that time. Now, over time, a pressing question emerged, or many pressing questions, I should say, but one pressing question emerged about how we might make visible the enormous plantation society and the Black geographies that stretched along various branches of the Cape Fear River from the 17th century right up to the present day, we might say. A range of interests and questions, as well as preoccupations with land holding, cemeteries, displacement, water based agriculture, transit, and sociality, all spark questions that might be addressed with many different types of tools and technologies, or that might allow us to get in touch with both the mud, so to speak, as well as the sky. And as a result, I began to turn to some of my colleagues at Northwestern, namely a then graduate student by the name of Emily Schwelby, whose PhD committee I was serving on, who was working on underwater archaeology, looking at rice creeks then in South Carolina. I turned to Dr. Schwelby in large measure because of the kinds of questions that my local collaborators were asking. Where was Chapman Branch, named after an ancestor of mine? Was there a Mount Misery Road, or where was Mount Misery Road? Over time, I developed a project that, with the help of the African American Heritage Foundation, that came to be supported by the Mellon and the American Council of Learned Societies. Along the way, this project included a number of PhD students, at least two, Emily Schwelby and Christopher Montague, a Black Studies PhD student who was working with me on historic archival training, as well as Northwestern undergrads, thanks to the Shabriah Center for Historical Studies. As a result of Dr. Schwelby's interventions, we also had an opportunity to engage with the North Carolina Underwater Archaeology Branch, as well as the North Carolina Heritage Commission by way of various historic sites, especially the site of Brunswick Town. We also engaged with a number of archival repositories, especially the Digital Library of American Slavery at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. This also required that we engage with other local scholars and consultants, such as Professor Tara White, and Professor Glenn Harris, both of UNC Wilmington, as well as the ongoing work of scholars of maritime studies at East Carolina University and various teams of public historians who are working to assemble digital archive records county by county through that same UNC Greensboro Digital Library of American Slavery. Over time, in dialogue with the work of Kim Gallen, I've been thinking about new questions about the diasporic conjunction that defied and continues to defy imperial and national conceptions of sovereignty, geography, and language at the limits of Black technological innovations. In this sense, the project also brings us full circle as we reconcile with concepts such as the Andes versus the coast, in South America, and the centrality of that space of reckoning and reasoning called the Caribbean, which was far more than a way station and surely constitutive of the very spaces that we theorize and maintain as mainland theaters of colonial and post-colonial life. Over time, we developed a website that was ultimately created by Kelsey Ryland and Emily Schwelby at Northwestern University. And that site is up now, which seeks to make visible those very landscapes that I mentioned earlier, that was a widespread or a large scale slave plantation society in the North Carolina lowlands. We created this site by overlaying a system of colonial maps using the technology of ArcGIS to begin to embed our more contemporary map with the location of various industries that were elaborated as a result of this massive slave plantation society. Now, the North Carolina lowlands became a slave plantation society really in the 18th century, in large measure owing to the longleaf pine tree. There, they innovated naval stores, tar, pitch, and turpentine for export. But this massive plantation complex that really dotted both sides of the Cape Fear River, up and down the Cape Fear, also spun off other industries such as salt works, salt mills, wood mills, shipbuilding industries, and the like. And you can begin to see the ways that we've used colonial maps to showcase some of those various kinds of industries that this slave plantation network ultimately catalyzed and helped to produce. Along the way, enslaved Africans and their descendants also um, cultivated rice, and they also cultivated indigo to a lesser degree. But it was naval stores that was ultimately the industry that made the North Carolina lowlands a massive slave plantation society. This next slide allows you to see an example of one of the older maps that we used to begin to build this particular site, and the process or methodology of overlaying those maps over contemporary GIS sites in order to render these plantation networks as well as the various industries that spun off as a result of them. Over time, we were actually able to also address a pressing question that our local interlocutors had regarding the location of an infamous trail called Mount Misery Road that local oral history suggests may have been used to ferry enslaved people from one side of the Cape Fear River to another and then to points beyond. Uh, as a result of the work of Emily Schwelby, we were able to actually identify the Mount Misery Ford, a kind of lowland landing or land bridge of sorts that led from the river, from the Cape Fear River, right on into northern Brunswick County, which ultimately Mount Misery Road is named for. The road is currently called Cedar Hill Road. And so we were actually able to demonstrate on the map the precise location of Mount Misery Road, which our local collaborators were very keen on identifying. Through our oral histories, which also were a part of this particular project, we also began to learn that there were other locations that were named in relationship to Mount Misery. Mount Misery was a sand dune on the other side of the Cape Fear River, named for its difficult locations in terms of cultivating and producing foodstuffs. But there was also a Mount Misery drain that was not terribly far from the road, et cetera, that oral histories actually allowed us to confirm. Our site is currently up, um, and you can see the URL here present and visit that site and engage with it and look at the various materials that are embedded in that site, including a broad annotated bibliography produced by Christopher Montague, who was also training in this site. Um, we're also anticipating, as the introduction mentioned, a new film that will come out very soon. We're in the process of doing final edits and transcriptions of that film, which tells the story of the African American Heritage Foundation of Southeastern North Carolina and this particular project that we were engaged in. And this project includes archival analysis. It includes the use of GIS, as I mentioned. It also includes a sort of expansive oral history collection. To date, we have collected almost 20 oral histories that we're also in the process of transcribing. Our goal is to collect 50 oral histories across the county of North Carolina. Uh, During our second year of this project, we also developed a series of programming initiatives aimed at furthering the collection of oral histories that we entitled Listening to History, where we convened groups of elders in different locations across the county to both discuss oral history, where they might actually share with us aspects of oral history that they wish to. That was one program. Other programs allowed us to actually interface with the first generation of students to integrate Brunswick County schools, where we actually interviewed them. By and large, our program or our project has really centered around mapping rural communities of Brunswick County along the lines of churches, cemeteries, schools, and juke joints, what we call sacred and social spaces of Black life. Now, this is not exactly novel, as many of our elders had already developed research projects like this project in the 1980s. And we also know that these various metrics and sites that I've emphasized here were also innovated by Zora Neale Hurston many years ago. So I thank you for allowing me to share some of these reflections on this project, and I'm happy to answer questions at this time.
Oh, this is so totally perfect because the students in both of my classes, they've looked at the WPA slave narratives. We looked mainly at Texas, and I wanted to ask you because I have not checked. Are there any slave narratives for North Carolina in the WPA narratives?
There are some slave narratives for North Carolina, and in
Okay.
fact, there is one slave narrative in particular that Christopher Montague, the PhD student who worked on the annotated bibliography, started to uncover and engage with during this research process during his time there, and it's noted on the site there in the annotated bibliography, among others.
Okay. And did do you what period is periodization? Like what are the uh, do you have like a beginning and an end or
Certainly. So in terms of slavery in southeastern North Carolina, we're really talking about the period between around the 1720s, around 1725, 1730 is when a kind of a British expedition from South Carolina are starting to really enter the region and gain a foothold there, and that runs right up into emancipation.
okay.
But the time period of this particular study is primarily Reconstruction forward to the 1960s, right?
Okay.
Because that's the time period that our local collaborators have been most interested in. That's the time period that much of our oral history allows us to capture and address. And so that's the time that we focused on. A lot of this grows out of my longstanding interest in my family genealogy. Both of my parents are from the region and trace their lineage back to the 18th century in this area. And so, what one of the things that I didn't mention that made me want to do this study is because I knew that if we did not do a proper study of this region, that we would have beautiful family trees that date pretty far back, but doing
No
this type of
connections and
research allows us to provide context to
context.
their lives. And so I am also working on slavery in the lowland North Carolina region simultaneous to this project, if you will. So,
Oh,
so much of our archive is related to slavery, uh,
Mhm.
while our oral history is related to the post-emancipation period.
Okay, I have just a couple more, and then I want to open the floor for others to ask questions. So, as first of all, I love that you're looking at your family as well, right? Are you using this to understand your own family history? I've been doing some of that too. It makes it even more compelling when you're looking for family connections. But I wanted to ask about um, how digitization is helping your project. If you can tease that out. Um, some of us are in this space and we're doing work and we've kind of learned over time, but how is this digital age that we're in, how is it impacting your scholarship?
The impact is really quite tremendous, right? So repositories such as the Digital Library of American Slavery is really just a rich place to start regarding slavery in the South in particular, but also North Carolina. And one of the things that they've been doing of late is they've actually been digitizing all the records that they have county by county.
Mhm,
So that allows us to really begin to search a range of records that you normally would have had to go to, say, the county courthouse and pull. So we have court cases, we have marriages,
mhm,
probate records, and the like from that alone. And so there's that. But I think also when you think about really the sort of digital visualization tool that we're able to build in terms of this particular site, allowing us to actually visualize
mhm,
where mills were, where kennels were, where one plantation was in relationship to another. We've also collected um, some data from runaway slave ads, for example,
mm,
thinking about sort of where those ads were placed in relationship to where people were said to be um, in relationship to the plantations themselves. And so there's a range of data that we can use to visualize
mhm,
different aspects of colonial life in order to then ask new questions about what we're actually seeing once we're able to visualize that data in particular, right? So it really kind of is a help, and then it also brings with it certain demands and challenges.
Now, what I love about it though is it brings you into a kind of physical engagement with history, because usually what we're doing is analyzing documents and writing.
Right.
But then you're having to learn how to do a lot of clicking, and using different programs, and I find that actually kind of refreshing that, okay, now I'm putting something on a map, and seeing kind of almost an kind of archaeological opportunity to show in a way that I know as a historian before these tools were available, I was not doing as much. It was sort of in writing, but now being able to put something even on a Google map
Absolutely.
is very helpful because some of us are more visual learners than not. So the last question I have is, or really an observation, going to a new state brings in a new slave economy in a way, right? So in
Hmm.
Texas, we hear a lot of talk about cotton
Hmm.
generally, right? When we think about slavery, but we don't hear a lot about naval stores
That's right.
or indigo, so we even have to become acquainted with some vocabulary um, related to the region that we might not have thought about And even with, say, the slavery that we are more familiar with in a city like Houston was urban slavery,
That's right.
right?
That's
And
right.
then you have to go out to Sugar Land to get
Right.
to the sugar plantation, and East Texas to get to the cotton. So the vocabulary changes, and it also means that it impacts the system differently, right? That how
Yeah.
people are socialized.
Absolutely. I appreciate that comment, especially the part about rural urban, right? Because I'm emphasizing one side of the Cape Fear River, and I'm emphasizing rural life, rural communities, and rural enslaved experiences in the context of naval stores, rice, indigo. But I'm also, even as I'm decentering Wilmington, this is also a story about Wilmington, which is the city that grows up on the other side of the river over time.
Mm,
And it's after the Spanish sacked Brunswick town in 1748 that Wilmington or Newton becomes, this growing town, right? Brunswick is the breadbasket for that urban town there, right? So in many ways, this will also enrich our understanding of urban life and urban
mm,
possibilities, or the sort of movement back and forth between the urban and rural, and the ways that they're always sort of entangled, if you will, right?
mhm.
And when does it become urban, right? So, of
Yeah.
course, these are these are all rather pressing questions in terms of making sense of the Cape Fear Lowland.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to open the floor to others who may have questions. Don't be shy. Come on camera and ask your questions. We're a nice group. We're here to learn.
I see a hand, please.
Go ahead.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Bryant, for this presentation. I'm grateful you did this work. I would like to know, is there a favorite part or moment, interview in this work that just really feeds your soul?
Hmm. Um, thank you for that question, and thank you for asking it that way. I think a favorite interview that feeds my soul is an interview that I did with my grandfather, who has since passed away in 2023. I had a chance to sit and interview him. He was a very close guide in this process. I would stop by and check in with him quite a bit, and he would always ask me questions about the project and how it was going. So I think that's my favorite one, that feeds my soul. I will add to that, however, one of the interviews that I think had um, rather profound impact on me was the interview that we did with our Listening to History series, when we interviewed um, the first students to integrate Brunswick County schools. And we did three of those at the various schools in the county. And and I think that, certainly in my lifetime, I had not really listened to the stories of what those experiences were like for our parents' generation to be integrating these schools, the kinds of things that they faced and endured. Um, and then integration is starting, the integration of the schools in North Carolina, in Brunswick County in particular, starting around 1966. And so, this is getting very close to, when I would be born, and then when we get into the 70s, when, so the idea that these people would now have to enroll their children in these schools where they had just experienced and endured all that they had. That has really impacted me in a rather significant way, and it provides me with a different context for thinking about the challenges of Black education in the rural South in, say, the mid 1970s, right? The late 1970s, even. and sort of thinking about and appreciating all that they faced, but also what they achieved, for us.
Shanice, you had a question?
Yes, hello. So great to meet you. So first off, I wanted to know if we can put that link in the chat so so it's clickable because I can't copy it and paste it for some reason. And also, I just found out that in my 23 and me composition that I also have family members from North Carolina, the West Piedmont areas. So is that part of where I know he said something about that, but how can I utilize this information to kind of go further in exploring how to find my personal family members in that area?
Great question.
How can you just repeat the last part of the question? I'm sorry, I was.
Yes, I asked how could I utilize this initiative because my family is from North Carolina. I just found that out, the West Piedmont area, and it's interesting that this is where your research is coming from. So with these oral histories, how can I find you know things that are like closer in nature to my family tree? Are these things that you know like we as regular people can just look up and see right now?
Yes, so thank you. So one of the things that I would say is on our site, and I am placing it in the chat. Um, on our site, there's an annotated bibliography that will point you to some useful source material um, to begin with. I think secondarily, I keep mentioning the Digital Library of American Slavery. I think that's also a very rich source, especially in terms of sort of the county records that it has. Uh, in addition to that, the use of ancestry is another, I think, useful tool in helping us to really do a great deal of family history. Um, that's another great place to begin.
LaJean Robinson and then Khalees Houston.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Dr. Bryant, nice to meet you, and thank you for being here. My question and my concern, rather, is the young people, and how do we jar them? History is wonderful, and I just learned the term this diaspora to scatter about, and in today's society, our young people they lean more towards Malcolm X and not Martin Luther King because of what they've seen, what they experience today, and they're rather on the violent side. They're not as patient as they were in the 60s. Um, so how do in the study, and I love your study, by the way, your continuing study, how do we jar young people with the knowledge of history, what the ancestors overcame in the midst of? And I think that's what history does is it shows you what they went through, what they were going through, and how they overcame. But with their mentality today, they're not willing to wait for that overcome. It should already be here. So how do we jar the young people into wanting to know their history, appreciate the history, and change the present? Thank you.
Thank you for that. That's a really challenging question there. And one thing I will say, we actually had a program this past Saturday over at the African American Research Center at the Gregory School here in Houston. And this program was a film screening of a film called Black Lives Matter in Latin America. Um, and it was a collaboration between the Gregory, the Center for African and African American Studies, and Emancipation Park Conservancy, and Dr. Gladys Walthor Mitchell from North Carolina Central University is the film producer and the scholar behind it. And so she gave a wonderful presentation. We watched the film, and then we opened up for Q&A. We had a beautiful turnout that on Saturday, and in the audience was a 16-year-old who spoke out and asked some questions. And one of the questions was, had we considered TikTok, right? And part of her point was, if you're looking for a young audience, you have to look for the technologies and the sites or the social media where they might be found, right? Some of them may be on Instagram, but her assertion and guidance to us was that that they're on TikTok, right? And so I think we have to take good knowledge and distill it in ways and disseminate it in ways that are accessible and really sort of impact algorithms, if you will, to reach some of these audiences, right? Outside of that, I think it's storytelling, right? You never know who's listening and when they're listening when you're dealing with kids, but my parents were storytellers, both of them. My grandparents, my great grandparents were storytellers, and so telling stories, sometimes funny stories about nicknames, might draw someone into to that love of history, right? And to that, and might pique the curiosity. And so I would just say, don't start telling those stories, or if you aren't, then start telling them.
Great. So Khalees, William, and then Dr. Esparza.
Hello again. Thank you so much for spending time with us. Very grateful for you and your presence. I love that last piece about sharing stories. That's actually how I got started in history. Growing up in little tiny East Texas, love when the old folks share them stories. So my question is that earlier you mentioned that tracing your history was a part of something that your family did, and that's how you started. So I was wondering, since your family was already tracing their history, were you just naturally into it because they were doing it, or did one day you just grab the torch and ran off with it? And also, you mentioned you have two daughters. Are they into this as well, or are they doing something completely different?
um, well, so how did I get started? I think I was, I was that kid who listened to stories, right? My parents had a story for everything, right? If you did something wrong, you got a story, just around the dinner table. Just jokes, right? Naming practices, right? Nicknames get placed on you when you do certain things that remind them. And so over the years, we had family reunions, right? And so um, I think I was probably fairly amazed that all these people could be related to me. And I would ask my mother constantly, well, how, right?
Mhm.
How are we related to this person and that person, right? And I really sort of say my mom is the real historian of the family. And so she would sort of chart those genealogies and give me a sense of that. It wasn't until I was maybe in high school that I got serious about Black history, and I think the increasing curiosity about Black history also pushed me to start to look at genealogy more. I've mentioned my great grandparents. I knew two great grandmothers, one who lived to be 104, and actually held one of my daughters, my oldest daughter, in her arms. Um, but I also knew that my grandmother's grandmother had been enslaved. Um, and that was pretty jarring for me. The idea that I could almost touch someone who had been enslaved, that I was touching someone who whose grandmother had been enslaved, right? And so that was pretty powerful to me. Um, so so yes, and I do, and my youngest daughter is an Africana Studies double major, and so you know we'll see what directions she might choose, but yes, I think that there is a way in which these things are rather palpable and kind of unavoidable in families. Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Dr. Esparza?
Oh, I still had a question, but I mean, I'll go after Dr. Esparza.
Apologize. I apologize. I didn't see the hand
Yeah, I
lowered.
lowered it because I know well, I lowered it, but yeah,
Okay, go ahead. Go
okay, I
ahead.
appreciate it. Sorry.
Go
Okay,
ahead. Mhm.
okay, sorry. Well, I just wanted to just first of all say, Dr. Bryant, that I appreciate you participating, you know, and talking to us this evening. I think your work is pretty interesting. I especially love the fact that you have, you know, done some work and research in regards to Colombia, especially Black people in Colombia. And, you know, you don't really meet a whole lot of African Americans who, at least in my experience, I haven't really met hardly up until tonight. I've never really met an African American historian that has done research, you know, in Latin America, you know, particularly Colombia, like you have. And what I just want to know, did you have to, you know, learn how to speak Spanish fluently to be able to do work in Colombia? You know, did you have to do that or not?
Yes, I definitely did. In in my PhD program, it was required for anyone who was working on topics outside of the U.S. We had to develop a proficiency in two languages.
Mm,
My languages were Spanish and Portuguese. But in order to do that primary research, that documentary based research, you have to master to some degree the language, and then there's also the question of paleography or the script, the handwriting of that time, right? So the manuscript writing that people did in the 17th century and 18th centuries were also what we had to manage and master to some degree. And I'll just say that, you know, it was an undergraduate professor of mine at North Carolina Central University by the name of Dr. Lolita Gutierrez Brockington, who was teaching Latin American history. Dr. Brockington was a scholar of, you know, of Latin America. She had already published a book about slavery in the Cortez haciendas of Tehuantepec, and was at the time working on a book about Blacks in Bolivia in the Eastern Andes. And so
mm.
it was her courses and the idea that there were people in Peru, in Bolivia, um, who looked like me and who experienced the same transatlantic slave trade that our ancestors endured, that really piqued my curiosity. You know, she would assign, you know, entire books, like she assigned Colin Palmer's Slaves of the White God my sophomore year. And so we read that text among others. Palmer was also at UNC Chapel Hill at the time and would come to Central and lecture at various times. And so it was those kinds of interactions that got me to thinking about the African diaspora to Latin America. And then later on, I started to think about places like Ecuador and Colombia. I studied Spanish in Ecuador. And so that's part of what really got me more interested and rooted in the Andes.
But just one more quick question. Was it hard to uncover that type of material? Because in America, we have a lot of written records about the slave trade and everything. So when you went to like Colombia, you know, was it hard to find that information?
Um, No, and I should say I started my studies in Ecuador, and I started in the National Archives, and inside of that National Archives was an entire section of documents called Esclavos y Negros,
Mm.
uh, blacks and slaves and blacks, and ultimately I started working in that section of the archives. But slavery was so extensive and ubiquitous, and it was so heavily governed by the colonial bureaucracy, including the church, that people of African descent are in lots of different kinds of documents in that archive or in those archives. I should also say that scholars in Colombia, especially now that you mentioned Colombia, have been writing and publishing and researching on this for generations. And that is one of the most productive academies addressing questions of the African diaspora currently today. And so I would say much of that is published in Spanish, but there's knowledge production there, and increasingly in Ecuador, the same is true.
Thank you. Okay.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Dr. Bryant. Sorry.
No problem. Dr. Esparza and then Tanisha.
Yes, Dr. Bryant, thank you very much for sharing your just fascinating research. Um, and I appreciate how you were able to sort of get us to think about this history, not just maybe in Texas or along the Gulf Coast. I think that you were able to connect the dots in very significant ways so that we think about this history as a global history. And not so much a regional history. I want to shift a bit in the questioning here, and I wanted to ask you. I'm interested in learning if you had been able to incorporate any of this research into your curriculum, or any of the primary sources that you have generated or uncovered and have used for your research. If you've been able to bring that into the classroom, and if so, how has that sort of been working for you?
Certainly, you know, I certainly use archival documents in the classroom. Much of what I've learned through this research informs the way that I think about the history, the way that I narrate history, and I think that primary sources, colonial sources, some of which are not necessarily my own primary sources, but there are other collections. Afro-Latino Voices, for example, is a great collection of primary sources that I tend to use in my classes. Those are sort of annotated primary sources that are translated in brief, that have guiding questions and those kinds of things that can kind of help students understand the document itself, what kind of document it is, the historical context that would have produced that document, right, and things like that, which I think are really concrete ways of helping students to think about some of the bigger ideas that you're trying to walk them through in a course that is both a course about the African diaspora on the one hand, and a course about colonial social life and social history on the other hand, right? So those kinds of documents are really quite crucial.
Thank you.
Mhm. Tanisha and then Carla. And those will be our last two questions for the evening.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Hi, and thank you for such a wonderful presentation. I just wanted to ask, as this is kind of the beginning of digitization, as Dr. Karen Kossie mentioned, how do you see this expanding? Could this be something that we could use as a culture, an African American culture who is still looking to define themselves? Um, and not just in the way of ancestry or genetics, but just a background resource to discovering um other states, other little hidden details that we just didn't know about it ourselves. I just want to discover so much about us as a people. And so what do you see this becoming? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that question. I think this is really I should say, a very vibrant and rich area of really humanistic methodology, historical methodology, that I am just sort of wading into. There are scholars at places like Brown University. I mentioned Kim Gallen. There's also a scholar by the name of Jessica Marie Johnson, who has a project called Life Code X, for Black Lives of Louisiana. These kinds of projects, I think, are really rich, and they have a great deal of nuance in them in terms of the metadata that's produced by these particular projects. And so I think it's really worth wading into, and really doing a deeper dive into what we might call the digital humanities. This is certainly a rich area. I would also mention the Slave Voyages database, which is currently housed here at Rice University. That is also another really rich tool. I think it's also important. There was an article today in U.S. News, I believe it was, about the so-called other slavery, which is Native American slavery, indigenous slavery, and those projects are also being enriched by digital methods. And so, if we begin to think about the kind of conjuncture of, African slavery and indigenous slavery, right? If we think about these two slave trades as, what I like to call coterminous, that they meet at a similar moment in the early modern period, it's really, really important for us to engage with these kinds of methods, to make visible histories that haven't necessarily been hidden, but perhaps have not been engaged sufficiently. uh, Thank you.
Right. Sorry before you go, but that last part was exactly what I was looking for. How you said that there are hidden gems
Yeah.
that we just don't know. Can you expand? I don't want to take the time, or maybe another session, but if anything could be written down or just shared in messages about that, I would love that. Thank you so much.
Okay. Carla and Randall. Carla?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Dr. Brian, I do want to say I appreciate you going out of your way to having to discover, going in depth for our history and our ancestry information, especially from a person who's Afro-Latina who likes to discover more into details of stuff like this. My concern is when you were going to the Esclavo y Negro section, what was the latest time period you were able to discover?
What was
Like
the
the
latest?
latest, yeah, the latest time period. Because I feel like in the United States it was 1400, but I feel like it's more. I feel like it goes even more further back into it.
Well, I should say that the kinds of archives that I tend to consult are colonial archives, right? They are archives that really are the stuff of Spanish colonialism, and so they really kind of start, the kinds of documentation that are available really starts in the late 1500s. That's really the kind of
Mm.
documentation that tends to be available there. I think that as we go farther back, it's important to recall the archaeological work that scholars were doing, really have to work at the intersection of multi-disciplines to do this kind of work. So, Dr. Brockington used to also speak from, the work of folks like Ivan Van Sertima, among others. So we have to sort of reassess and re-engage with that kind of scholarship as well. It's there.
Okay,
Oh, okay.
Randall and then Dr. Meeks.
Good afternoon,
Randall.
Dr. Bryant.
Okay.
I just wanted to take this opportunity to say that it is firstly great to see you and to thank you so much for sharing your reflections and your research. It's very insightful. My maternal ancestry is from a town called Sneads Ferry, North Carolina, and this has allowed me to appreciate her journey. Um, Very young when she passed. She was part of the Great Migration coming up from that area in the early 20s into New York City. And so I just wanted to say thank you because it's given me an opportunity to reflect on not just her journey, but the journey of so many of our ancestors and the appreciation of the gift that we have to make the most of it and to just kind of really appreciate what all of those have gone before us have gone through and to ensure that we're doing all that we can to respect that promise. But I just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing your insight.
Thank you, Randall. Thank you so much. It's good to see you. It's great to see you. And thanks for sharing that.
All right. Thank you so much.
Professor, thank you. That was wonderful. Professor Meeks.
Thank you, Dr. Kossie, for giving me an opportunity to speak. And I want to thank Dr. Bryant for coming and speaking to our students. You mentioned one of the databases that several students that are on here are looking at. Well, they looked at last week, which was the slave voyages. And I think it's important, and you talked about this earlier, in terms of meeting people where they are, meeting students where they are. And digitization is the move that history is going to. And I think it's also important that our students see scholars who are actually doing the work so that they can imagine, right, the possibilities that are out there for them. Because, for example, the GIS, we've had students who've worked on GIS projects before, and just understanding what value that adds to you as a scholar is important. And so I really thank you for coming and talking to us. And so again, so our students can see historians who look like them that are doing this type of work, and it helps them understand that this is not something that's closed off to them.
Yeah.
Right. It's attainable. It's something that they can really do. So I greatly appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for saying that so much. This reminds me of some of the things that are literally embedded, right? So when you begin to think about mapping and you begin to think about, territories and geographies, you also then have to contend with the histories of those spaces, not just in terms of Black folks or folks, described as Black occupying those spaces, but also you begin to think about really sort of ecological questions,
Yes.
questions of not just land dispossession, but also the questions of development of companies coming into these locations, some of the ecological and environmental hazards, right? So we quickly get into environmental history. We quickly get into questions of health, uh,
Right.
and the disproportionate impact that ecological incursion has upon communities occupying
Mm-hmm.
land and
Yeah.
territory in certain places. So, and these tools, I think, are really rich in giving our students new opportunities
Mm-hmm.
to move into some of these areas of research that are not reducible to history.
Right.
So you can do this, you know, outside of history, right? History is really important in terms of informing this, but there's other work to be done as well, right? That's,
Exactly.
so.
And it's the gateway. Like,
Yeah.
I know we don't like to think sometimes about that, but history is crucial. And history touches literally every aspect of life and any career. Like, there's a history there. And so I will always try to advocate for people to be historians. I
Yeah.
know that not everybody wants to do that, but there's so many different ways that you can go. And so I appreciate you, Dr. Kossie, for putting this together. And Dr. Bryant, again, thank you so much for coming and speaking to our students.
Well, we really are history.
Yeah.
We're good. And I love too, the technology has all of us on the same screen, listening to the same person. We're in different parts of the city and maybe even country. And we're here to think about this very important topic. I wanted to close with thoughts about Michelle Roth-Trujillo. I put
Yes.
just a basic little outline of the argument he makes in his book, Silence in the Past. And he says that silence is enter into the historical narrative in four important places. Because, some of, I think Carla and different ones were asking questions about how they get to their own history. So he says that the first area where these silences enter into the historical narrative is through the making of archives. You heard Dr. Bryant mention archival research, going to these places. There has to be a place where this information is held. Now, for the average person, your archive is probably a drawer or a chest of drawers, something that we'll still call it an archive because it's the place where you're collecting this information. Some of your mothers and grandmothers, they probably had a place where they kept material. And for them, it was the letters or the documents, but that would be an archive. But there's the economic resources that you need for a formal archive will impact what's collected, how it's collected, how long it's collected. Okay, there have to be funds available for that. The silences also enter into the narrative through the interpretation of archives. Like you have to have some skills to go in and know what you're looking at. I've heard of different scholars going to a place where somebody was getting ready to throw out major historical documents that might have been used to help understand an entire community or an entire group of people because they just thought, oh, it was just some papers. But a researcher will be able to look at it and say, well, this is actually very valuable. And we can see this trend through this collection or whatever. So in the interpretation of archives, that's where trained historians come in, trained archaeologists, people who have training to know how to look at what they have in their hands. And regular people too, as well. You can know, okay, I think this is important. So those silences can enter there, though, in that interpretive phase. The third phase where the silences can enter is with the writing of history. And writing the history requires attention to the skills that you need to write. When I started out, I started writing stories that my dad told from the pulpit. And he told me, he said, God told me to write, but I was so busy trying to build a church. I said, well, Daddy, I'll write it for you. So that's how I ended up in grad school, writing down some stories, and it ended up becoming a dissertation on African American Pentecostalism in the Southwest. So the writing of history, that's the other phase, because right now it's still a dissertation, it's not a book yet. And it's supposed to be a book, right? So I still have another step to go. And then that final phase is in the making of history. So, okay, the book is written. but is it just sitting on a shelf? Scholars have to be engaged in sharing their work. I used to be a little shy about that, but if you don't share what you found, who's going to know about it? So forums like this are important for me because they allow us to share, right? And I'm so grateful for all of you who have taken the time to come and share. Dr. Brian has shared with us, and you're sharing in this experience by listening, which is very important. We all were talking, different ones mentioned the stories. Khalees said she loved listening to elderly people talk. I did too. I was always trying to eavesdrop because their conversations always seemed a lot more interesting than mine.
Mine and grown folk business.
There you go. So what this program is allowing us to do is to think about those phases of historical production. And so when people ask you what historians do, you can say they're people who busy themselves with the making of archives, the interpretation of archives, the writing of history, and the making of history to make sure that we are able to appreciate all the research that they've done. So we want to thank you again, Dr. Bryant, for taking the time to share with us. And I want to thank each and every person who came on. I even see somebody here on here, Dr. Bryant, that I taught in 1993.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. This is rich.
Thank you, Pastor Baker, Carrie Baker, who is also here. I appreciate your coming.